Welcome to Giving Back is Dead. Many thanks to Coolapat and Y Architecture for hosting us today. Also thanks in particular to my team, Joshua Geyer, Vajra Kingsley, and finally a thanks to Michael Woodsmall, part of the Y Architecture team, for inspiring the whole idea of Giving Back is Dead. Giving Back is Dead is about the evolving landscape of giving to the arts. We're very pleased today to be talking to Stephen Reily. And Stephen Reily is introducing Remuseum. It's an initiative funded by David Booth and sponsored by Crystal Bridges with additional support from the Ford Foundation. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Scott.
I wonder if you could begin telling us a little bit about yourself and about the genesis of this initiative.
Thanks. Well, Scott, you know, I did never really expect it to be in the museum world on the inside. I started professionally as a lawyer and then an entrepreneur for the last 25 years. All the way along since my teens, I've been an art collector, passionate about artists and the art, and I've been on a lot of museum and arts organization boards. Thought I would always just be a fan and supporter, but about 6 years ago, I live in Louisville, Kentucky, where Coolapat Yantrasast and Y Architecture had designed a complete reinvention of the Speed Museum, our state's largest and oldest art museum. It had been closed completely for that 3.5-year renovation, reopened, a few bumps in the road in that first year. The director left.
And you were chairman of it at that point.
I had not been on the board for 10 years, so I had no involvement in the day-to-day of the museum, but the board asked me if I would step in, first as an interim, and a few months in I was having fun and it was going well, so I stayed eventually for about 4+ years.
Weren't you also involved in the conception of the museum by Coolapat?
I had been part of some conversations, but again, and gotten to know and be a huge fan and friend of Coolapat's and followed the project, but really from a distance. So I found myself then bringing this amazing new building to life, building a new operating model from my business perspective, and really trying to reinvent the role of a great museum to its city and state.
And why did they ask you to become the interim director, really?
Well, I wondered the same thing myself sometimes. I figured they must have asked many people before me, but I think my combination of being a collector, being an arts patron, I think even more than they realized, I'd been an amateur student of museums since I first got involved on a museum board when I was barely 30.
So tell us now about this new initiative, the Remuseum. What is Remuseum and how is it that you decided to
help launch it? Well, you know, when I left the Speed, I spent some time thinking about what I had learned, and particularly some of the questions I had that I had not been able to answer. Some of the things that were kind of itches that needed scratching. And somewhere in that process, I got a call out of the blue that this great collector named David Booth, who's on the board of MoMA, had visited Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, been very excited by the innovation he saw there. In conversations with Alice Walton, said, what if we just set up something to help museums innovate? And that was about it. And the way I describe it now is that if you think about where museums were 30 or 40 years ago, the mission statements they had were largely built around preserving and presenting objects to a pretty passive public. And now even traditional museums, conservative museums, have mission statements that are much more, like Crystal Bridges, like almost all museums, about serving and engaging the public with art. But the field is still pretty heavily burdened with a set of policies and practices that really relate to those old missions. They're not bad. I love objects and art. I love what museums can do with them. But the museums themselves are a little slow to be pushing themselves into the future.
So if I understood correctly, the part of the project is you aren't going to look at relevance and engagement, but in addition, funding models and also governance activities.
Exactly.
Can you give us a little bit of a sense, because we're hearing a lot about relevancy, diversity, impact.
Right.
But we don't hear much about new models of funding. I mean, I thought mostly what you were trying to do was to look at this unsustainable business model of museums.
Well, when I was in the, it didn't take long before I was in a museum before I woke up one day and I said, now I understand what a non-sustainable business looks like. Because if you're there, even if you have a big endowment, every January 1st, you start from scratch and you have to raise most of your revenue. And it is really, really hard. And I left the museum and I thought, why is it that hard? On the one hand, museums are more compelling than ever. The visual arts has changed and become more relevant to more people than ever. Museums have more assets than any other cultural institutions in America. Shouldn't we be able to figure that out? Why is it so hard?
Do you have an answer?
So, well, we're getting there. I mean, I think one of the things is museums just have to become more flexible and experimental in trying new things. I think one of the things, you look at the habits they have, that's what's burdening them. In some ways, a museum is like an iceberg. And if you work in one, what you realize is all people see is the tip of that iceberg. And it's not just a 10 to 90 percentage. If you think just about the permanent collections of the average large-scale encyclopedic museum, they aren't showing more than 5% of their collection. But they're growing that collection inexorably. They never stop. That's what they praise every year. They trumpet the number of objects they've added to their collection, and they go into storage, and they become increasingly expensive to store with very high standards of care.
So that can't be relevant.
It's how are those works relevant to the public when they never see them? There are museums asking that question, but also it's incredibly expensive. So like that iceberg, there's a risk that these collections could end up just sinking the museum. The AAMD, which is a museum association of museum directors, which has only 235 of our art museums in it, recorded from 2014 to 2018, their museum collections grew by 17%, over 3 million objects. If you keep that up, it's just, there's no end in sight. They'll have to keep renting more and more storage facilities, and then the museum's going to be run by its storage facility.
But during COVID, they made some kind of an agreement to permit museums to deaccession.
Well, this deals only, and I don't think this is only a question about deaccessioning, but since you bring it up, the rules changed and for a brief period allowed museums to deaccession work, which they had entered into their permanent collections, and use the proceeds, one, to buy more art, which they have always been able to do, but to fund operations. Almost no one did that, and that was a decision the museums themselves made. The rules have since changed to allow the proceeds to be used for direct care of the collections, which is a modest loosening. But I think museums aren't dealing with the bigger question. There are other things to be doing than just adding perpetually to this unlimited, bottomless pit of their permanent collection. The Metropolitan Museum in the end of the year announced a gift from the estate of Philip Guston, a great American artist, of 220 objects. The only artist with Philip Guston now has more works in the collection of the Met by 3 or 4 times than any artist in the course of human history.
It's really incredible.
And
of course, we read that article by Roberta Smith in the New York Times about this. But I didn't think that she really got to the complete picture of the problematic aspect of these 220.
So Roberta Smith questioned it from an aesthetic perspective and this representation and equity question, like is any one artist deserving of that, especially a white male artist at this time? What I thought, what you say is the same thing I had thought. Why are they burdening their storage facilities with 220 objects, few of which they'll ever be able to show? So it's not, and now they may be confronted, they've agreed to never ever deaccession them, but what instead if the Met had gone to the Guston estate, and they may not have been willing, but had said, what if we take 20 of them, and we facilitate gifts to 20 other museums, each of which get 10 amazing Philip Guston works? How much better would that have been for the missions of American museums and their balance sheets?
Why do you think that didn't happen? Actually, I had something to do with the Guston estate when I was working at Centre Pompidou, and with the same person who made the gift.
Well, why do you think?
I think that it probably had to be, I think probably the museums simply say yes.
Yes.
And I think the museum an enlightened museum should have been in a position, I think that they could have worked with his daughter to do that, because it seems to me to make much more sense for every reason.
I agree. But they're, that delicate dance, and they offered a big gift of money as well, but sometimes museums will do better by saying, we've just got to figure it out in a different way for our own future.
Well, as a former director of museum, do you think the amount of money they got, I think they got $100 million, didn't they?
They had $10 million.
Oh, $10 million?
Yes.
Not $100 million.
For study of Philip Guston's work, yes.
Yeah, well, is that sufficient? And it's restricted to the study of the work?
I believe so. I think and maybe other things, so I don't know that answer. I think that the answer is the 220 a number? When is it enough? What is too much? And I don't think people are asking that question. And as you said, there are lots of reasons to ask it, but from a financial perspective only, I've talked to a museum director in New York who's renting 13 storage facilities in New York. The answer is obvious. There will be 26 storage facilities for that museum before long, 50. And no one is saying, they all know it's unsustainable, but no one is saying when to stop.
Why do you think? Why are they not saying
Because if you think about, well, first of all, I've been guilty of this myself as a patron, as a museum director. Nothing made me more excited than either supporting or getting that
more
great
gifts.
acquisition. But we have to then really push ourselves and say, is each one of them worth it for the public we serve, for the financial sustainability of the museum we serve? The standards of care are the same thing. The European museums, the New York Times, we know that we have now created standards of care for the collections that we preserve that are so absolute that they are environmentally crazy. They're insensitive to the environment and they're super expensive. The European museums, a number of them have just started loosening them by a little bit, by a couple of degrees of temperature or humidity levels, and they're saving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year each to preserve the work, but to do it a little more reasonably.
Is that sufficient as a solution?
I think it's a start. I mean, when you see, once you've run one of these institutions and know it is really hard to make this machine work, we have to start being as creative as the artists whose work we celebrate in finding solutions for our future.
What intrigues me about all this, let's go back to the whole, to your previous statement, that the difficulty of running one of these museums is that each year you have to, once again, get the funds necessary to run it.
Right.
What intrigues me about this, this particular unsustainable business model is the trustees themselves, who many or most of the trustees are business people. And they certainly do not run their businesses in a way that they accept that a museum can run its business.
Right.
Why? Why do they accept this?
Sometimes
you were running the museum, you were running a board.
And I had been one of those trustees who sometimes felt like I was checking everything I'd learned in life at the door before I entered the boardroom. I mean, I think it's because they are passionate collectors. They like art. To some degree, they like the esteem that brings them. But you're right, they do things they would never do in their business. They build buildings they don't know how they're going to pay for. They add collections that they don't know how they're going to pay for the storage. And they aren't willing, with proportionate generosity, to fund the everyday operations that actually fulfill the mission that they're there to serve.
So, because I think also, even if we go back to the question of relevancy and impact and diversity, it intrigues me that the museums are talking in terms of numbers, and I think they should be talking also in terms of the funding model.
Right.
Until the funding actually changes, how can you really make a difference in terms of the diversity model?
Well, I think they're going to be forced to. I'll point out a couple of ways. One is that it's not talked about in this way much, but we have just gone through. At first, we thought COVID was going to be terrible for arts institutions, that they said 34% of museums were going to close. There's only one museum that was already struggling that I know of that is closed, because we had, for 2 years, the highest period of federal funding of the arts in anybody's lifetime, because the PPP loans, the shuttered venues grants, and others. Most museums in America have received millions of dollars of federal funding. Usually you're lucky to get a $50,000 NEA grant. And those are running out.
Yeah, so that's permitted them basically to continue these bad business practices.
That's in your words. I think many of them are going to hit a wall.
Yeah.
The other thing they've been in denial about, which they are going to see, I don't know if it's next year or 5 years, is they are refusing to engage what you and others call next-gen donors in the kind of messages and impact they are looking to support. I believe the arts can do that. Some people say, and it was true during COVID, rich donors were saying, well, I need to support my community, human needs, hunger, whatever. I think people want to support arts and culture, but they want to see it making the kind of difference they want. And younger donors, the children and grandchildren of the people who've been keeping museums alive, are looking for them to do different things, more focused on these public serving missions and impact.
Can you elaborate? What are these public serving missions?
Well, I think a lot of it is what they're doing, but instead of saying, you look at an average museum's annual report, half of it or more is devoted to the acquisitions we made last year.
And the building campaign.
And
the new building and the building campaign, and they don't talk about who's paying for the toilets.
And I think, well, there's that. And I think just a simpler message of, why don't you devote as much space in your annual report to the lives you're changing every day?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that will then, it's what we praise, what we incentivize will change the stories we tell and why people support us.
So you think a museum can really be a force for social impact?
Of course it can.
How?
I love museums because you see it every day. We just need to do more of it. Again, remember, if we get our heads, we have to have the objects and the policies that keep the thing alive and run ethically. But if we balance that equally with a public-facing mission, and every day say, are we spending as much time thinking about how our wall text, how our exhibits, how our welcoming entrance is impacting human beings as it is preserving the things we're here to preserve, then I think we'll come out okay.
So basically, would you say that the objective of Remuseum initiative is to make a significant change in the way museums are running?
They need it.
So is that, that's
yes,
the idea,
yes,
that's what you're trying to
is.
do. Do you think that this change can come from the level of the museum director, or should it be coming more from the trustees? Who can be the impetus behind making real change?
So early on, a couple things, when I started looking at this, innovation is not happening because the research and information isn't out there. When I left the museum, I found an amazing book written by a bunch of economists in 1990 talking about these issues of unsustainability. 20 years ago, a great scholar wrote a dissertation about the lack of utilization of permanent collections. Nobody needs a new white paper.
Yeah.
What we need is, you wonder, why is it not happening? Well, I think it has to be a new set of conversations between boards and the leaders that they employ.
Do you think the AAMD is a force that can be a force of change in this, or no? Or it will be just an initiative like Remuseum?
Well, I think the AMD is a group of museum directors. It's not all museum directors. I think that group alone is not enough. We have to figure out how to change the conversations directors are having with their trustees.
Whenever there's a discussion about some significant change of museums, there's always a reference to that group or
a criticism of them.
Or a criticism,
Right,
but
so
mostly, this whole thing about deaccessioning, they set up the criteria and everybody decided more or less they would adhere to those criteria.
So we could talk about deaccessioning. So if you look at the permanent collections again, the only way to make change, it's like a diet. You have to change your intake or you have to change your output, right? Or it's just going to keep growing and growing unsustainably.
Yeah, it's like an income statement.
Yes, but the only thing I think is you also can change what your inputs are. And so if you leave aside the question of should deaccessioning rules be changed, I think museums aren't nearly creative enough in the way that they acquire art. So for example, it's said that we can't change the rules against deaccessioning because it's what donors told us they wanted to do. Museums need to start asking donors, would you be okay if we accept your work and let's say we keep it for agree to keep it for, 20 years, but then maybe say at that point, if it doesn't suit our needs, would you be okay with selling it?
Do you think that how they would answer that?
I think a lot of donors would say that's okay. Fine with me. When I ran a museum, we had donors give us work. Some said, I just want you to keep it for 3 years to preserve my tax deduction, and then you can do whatever you want with it.
What about the donations that have been received by people who are now dead?
Well, that can be negotiated with the estate. You can say, so just like the example of the Guston loan, the Met could ostensibly try to put a little pressure back on the Guston estate. I think museums could say, this is a burden for us. Would you be able to do it on these flexible terms? MoMA just agreed with the Bill William Paley Foundation. Paley, a great founder of CBS, a great patron of MoMA, chairman of the board, gave them huge masterpieces. I don't know the story exactly why. When he died, instead of leaving some work to the Met, he left it to his foundation. The foundation has had it on long-term loan to MoMA, I said the Met. Now, the foundation and MoMA have agreed they will sell the work to fund digital initiatives at MoMA. If MoMA had received the work, they couldn't have done the same thing. And very few people at least, are complaining that these works the sale of these works are now going to disadvantage MoMA. The sale of the works, which Paley himself might have been happy about, are going to advantage them in looking for a better future on the digital horizon.
I wonder if this is not also a generational change. Because I think I've seen, like recently with LACMA, for instance, when they've closed most of the museum for reconstructing, for constructing this new building, that they tried to have off-sites, so that some of the work would be shown elsewhere in the city. And I've heard some of the donors were infuriated that work that they had donated to the museum was now being shown somewhere else that they didn't like, because they said the terms were that it would be shown there.
Yeah.
And my thinking is probably the next generation donors would be much more agreeable to that kind of an arrangement.
I think a donor, to me, who has a truly philanthropic intent wants to see the art enjoyed and changing lives wherever they can do it safely.
Yeah. So one of your themes that we've discussed is that you think America has funds, sufficient funds for nonprofits.
I do.
And that the issue is really historical ways that the museums are operating, which really is an impediment to be able to continue to attract more donations.
I think museums have done amazing things and sometimes constrained their own opportunities, both structurally for reasons that could make them more financially sustainable, and sometimes not wanting to be as relevant as they can be to the masses, which I think would bring the kind of support they need to survive.
And go back, we've also talked a lot about this, buildings, new buildings and expansions, which basically, are there statistics about whether or not this increases audience and responds to the needs of the community?
Well, I feel a little humble answering this question in the offices of a museum architecture firm that does beautiful work around the country. I think two things. The evidence is very clear that over time, the expansion plans end up being more expensive than planned. There was an extensive University of Chicago study 10 years ago about hundreds and hundreds of arts facilities.
Yeah.
And over time, they do not, in general, generate new audiences for the institution. Also, I think this is the part on the donors and collectors, that people who fund these capital campaigns, in my experience and watching across the country, do not fund the mission-based operating budgets of the museums with proportionate generosity.
Why is that? I mean, why is the museum not requiring that? It would seem normal if someone gives a major gift or a building, that in addition to that, they would also ask to have some kind of funds available to be able to operate it.
Well, they have started in the sense that sometimes they're now trying to raise endowment funds to fund the operations, but they're rarely sufficient to really fulfill what this new building is meant to do. What I mean is that if you, let's say you have a $100 million building project and you make a $10 million gift to it, those donors, I rarely see funding 10% of the resulting operating costs. They may say, we'll take $2 million of my gift to fund the endowment, but that's just a small piece of the cost that results. So they seem to be willing to ask other people to fund the mission-based operating costs of the institution they were willing to build.
Why? It seems terribly anti-philanthropic.
Well, it gets to philanthropic intent. And this is where I think some trustees may be motivated. This is where the conversation has to change. They have to be made. And I think that what I learned in museums about financial unsustainability was not a secret. It's just the field didn't want to talk about it. We all want to seem successful, but we have to let the donors understand the real everyday challenges of making it work and the mission that we're all passionate about, how to really fund it.
Have you seen a difference between private museums and public museums and how they're looking at these issues?
Well, we're at an interesting point where American wealth is so great and the unequal distribution of it is so great. There are people who theoretically can fund and endow in perpetuity a museum that never needs a dollar from someone else. I personally think the challenge of that is twofold. They aren't taking into consideration increased ambitions over time that may require more funds. And they aren't actually dealing with the relevance question. If you don't have to matter to enough people to support you, are you really worth the cost of making it happen? Not for me to say, but I think
I think it's a relevant question, and often when you talk to museum directors, they hate when you use audience figures as some kind of a criteria.
Why do you think
relevance.
That is?
Well, and have you looked at all about, do you think the situation is different elsewhere in the world? How do you see when you think about Europe or Asia or the Middle East?
So I'm looking only at the American Museum, primarily because the funding and governance model is so different and so unique that the government, the state-owned, state-funded museums in Europe have a whole different set of opportunities, challenges than the ones here.
Well, see, I think that even though there is much more significant state funding in most Western European countries, Certainly, we've already seen the UK. The UK has required its even major institutions like the Tate to increase a significant amount of non-governmental funding for their yearly operating costs. And I think this is only going to increase. And I think it's naive of Western European institutions to not be looking at what you're doing.
Right.
So I think that what you're doing has relevance also for elsewhere in the world.
We may be showing them the way.
It won't be as dramatic yet.
Yes.
But it will come, I think, in the next 10 years. They're going to be increasing their budgets for military, for probably social services, for energy costs, and the first thing that governments will have a tendency to cut will be funds available for culture.
We may learn from each other. The European museums modifying slightly their standards of care is one example. The American museums have been rigidly afraid to make any modifications to that.
Do you think that this will change? The American museums will begin to lower their standards?
Well, it's interesting. I think about an issue completely, I may be surprised I bring it up, like criminal justice reform, right? There were a lot of progressive activists complaining about mass incarceration and saying we need to change this. What made it change is when the costs became intolerable to the conservatives, then they came together to promote criminal justice reform. So I do think this issue of financial sustainability could bring people from all sides together in museums to say we've got to start changing the way we do this.
I just have, excuse me for insisting upon the fact that I think that financial sustainability and how the institution is funded is directly relevant for diversity and engagement.
They are completely related, because if we are only going to be funded by a small cohort of aging collectors,
that's right,
then a couple things are going to happen. We're not going to be sustainable, and we're not going to really matter to the people we say that we want to be welcoming and engaging in our museums.
Now, you've already had a series of initial discussions with museum people, with trustees, with museum directors. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happened, what your thoughts are from these initial discussions?
I've been talking to everyone I can, museum directors, trustees, auction houses, consultants, architects, people outside the field, venture philanthropists. They're all excited by some of the opportunities, but also warn me about the quixotic aim of trying to change a field that's very successful in its ways, and has made it. In spite of people saying museums are going to fail, they're all making it.
Why? Why do you think?
Well, it's been a long time. Museum expenses have always, for over 100 years, exceeded their revenues. So there's some accustomation to these structural deficits that donors either fund or they figure out the next answer, but also increasingly these sort of black swan events that have been recurring. So there was the dot-com bust, there was the 9/11, there was the 2008 Great Recession, there was COVID and civil unrest, there's stock market booms and busts. So in some ways, I think museums have almost had a hard time imagining a more sustainable model for themselves, because they just keep reeling almost back and forth between expansion, shrinkage, crisis, market crash, and they don't know there might actually be a way, if they would lean into their public serving futures, that the money might appear.
Yeah, but we can't really call it magical thinking, because as you say, they have survived on this model.
So maybe I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today, and many thanks to Stephen Reily for taking the time, and we look forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Me too. Thank you, Scott.
Okay.
All right. Thank
you. Be sure to check out our latest podcast and subscribe to Giving Back is Dead.